Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started. So welcome everyone. We are going to get started on our week 7 of 8 in the KOW 8-week webinar series. Trying to use our time here as we can as things start to get back to normal with construction industry, building inspections, and really our everyday lives. But this is week 7. If you've joined us before, welcome back. If you haven't, welcome. None of the weeks build on each other. They all stand alone. So we're going to go ahead and dive in here. Today's topic, we're going to go over property condition reports, guidelines, and strategies. We're just going to go over a little bit about what we believe the strategy is and how you should use the report and interpret it. All of these webinars, again, will be done before 2 o'clock. All of these webinars will then be shared for free on demand on our YouTube channel. So for anyone who's curious or interested or wants to share it with a colleague or coworker, you can let them know. If you go to YouTube and just go to KOW Building Consultants, you'll find a lot of videos we do. I did a whole inspection tutorial, which got cut short, unfortunately, because of COVID in the field. But these 8 weeks, again, this is week 7 of 8, are all up there or will be up there as soon as I'm done. So let's go ahead and get started. So first things first, the question is, what are we talking about today? What's today's goal? So here's today's goal. If you are someone new to the industry, if you're someone that has some experience or even considerable experience, and you have wondered, will wonder, or do wonder about what exactly goes into a property condition report, how do we interpret certain things, how do you use it, and what's the end goal or limitations or power of the report, that's what we're going to talk about today. So let's go ahead and dive in. Again, I am Ken Willey from KOW Building Consultants, our consulting firm based here in New York. We also have offices and coverage of basically the eastern part of the United States, as well as Colorado and the surrounding states. We do construction consulting, building inspections. I please encourage you, if anyone's curious, to go to kowbc.com. There's more information on our company, and we can do anything at this time or in the future. Let us know. Send an email, give us a call, what have you. So property condition report guidelines and strategies. As we continue through this webinar, if you have any questions, I encourage you to go ahead and put them in the chat function, and I will get to them either during or at the end. We'll see how this flows. But I encourage you to go ahead and let me know via chat if you have any questions. All right, well, let's start with the most obvious. What is a property condition report? And before I dive in any further, I should say, you know, a PCR, which is what we all seem to call it in our industry, property condition report, goes by a lot of different names. And we're going to touch on why or how that was today. Physical needs assessment, property condition assessment, engineer's report, structural inspection. A lot of these things get thrown in the same bin of what you're actually looking to accomplish. So let's start at the property condition report definition, and we'll go into a little bit of history of how we got here. First of all, it's an observation, not an inspection. Seems like a minor point, but I think it's worthy to discuss a little. So an observation would be you're showing up to do this property condition report, and actually what you're doing is you're doing a property condition assessment to write a property condition report. More on that in a moment. But it's not an inspection. What's the difference? Well, I'll tell you what an inspection is, for example. If you have a construction site, let's say just to keep things neat and clean and easy, you've got a construction site somewhere in upstate New York, so not New York City. And let's say you finished doing all of your rough plumbing. You've done your copper, you've done your cast iron, you've done your gas piping, your rough piping and plumbing is done. You need to close up those walls. Now you need to get your mechanical work approved. You need to get your electrical work approved. You need to get all these things approved. But let's just stay with plumbing for the moment. You would call, as the contractor or the developer, the building department. And they're going to send the plumbing inspector out. Maybe it's a town that has one inspector that does a lot of different things. Maybe it's a town that has a dedicated plumbing inspector. But that plumbing inspector is going to come out, look at that wall or those walls, and say, approved. Okay, you can install sheetrock. You can install insulation, you can fire caulk, you can finish this wall as far as plumbing is concerned. That's an inspection. That is bringing that building or that project from one area, walls not closed up, to another area, walls closed up. So property condition report, we say, is an observation. It's a site observation. It is the first time we're in the building, and it is the last time we're in the building. And I think that's worthy to keep in mind. So to do a property condition report, the assumption is you're there once and you're there once. Most items, or a lot of items, are going to be covered and unobservable. This is an existing building. Can you do a property condition report on a construction project? You can. It really doesn't fit well, particularly if it's a not very far along construction project. Can you do a property condition report on a vacant piece of land? No, you can't. So a property condition report, we should automatically think of an existing, operating, and functioning facility, apartment building, office building, auto body shop, hotel, ice skating rink, whatever it is, it's occupied. Or at least it's complete. Therefore, most things are covered with sheetrock, walls, ceilings, floors, and unobservable. Most things. So we're there to assess the current condition and report issues. We're also going to forecast out costs and work attention, things that need to be done. So just a little history. There have always been people and companies to look at buildings and assets and say, here are your issues, or you're okay, or I like the roof, or I don't like the roof, or your boiler's shot, or your windows are leaking, whatever it might be. But there were really only loose standards regarding reporting at individuals for a long time. And because there were loose standards, there was not a lot of consistency in our industry. Early 90s, Resolution Trust Corporation, 1995 Standard & Poor, and then 1999, the ASTM standard started to standardize a lot of these things. So the folks at the ASTM, American Standards of Testing, have been writing guidelines and requirements for different things for a long time. They decided in 1990 to write one for a phase 1 environmental site assessment. They learned that they could make some pretty good scratch by selling this, so the light bulb goes on. A few years later, they write the guideline. So they wrote the guideline, which is kind of the industry standard today, the ASTM 2018-99. Now, the 2018, don't be fooled, that has nothing to do with the year. That is the number of the guideline. And then the dash is 99, the 1999 version. So it is similar to other standards like the phase 1, and it notes to you what you should and should not do, or can and cannot do in doing a property condition assessment and issuing a property condition report. What's the current version? 2018-15. In 2015, they gave an update. They added some things. They gave a little more detail on handicap accessibility tables. So that's the current form we're using. So anyone out there who wants to talk about property condition reports, we could get a call today from someone we haven't worked for in Seattle, and they could say, do you do ASTM property condition reports? And I'd say, yes, we're talking the same language. So what it's done is it's standardized the reporting, it's standardized the limitations. There have been many names: physical needs assessment, capital assessment needs report. But the PCR is kind of stuck as the most common. Now, can you have a ASTM PCR where you also want some additional things? Of course you can. You could absolutely ask for anything you want. You could say, you know what, I'd like you to do the ASTM standard, but I'd also like you to do X, Y, and Z. No problem. As long as you're a consultant and you are in agreement with terms and limitations, then you're all on the same page. But generally, we accept now that we do a PCA and we issue a PCR. The standard can be purchased. Yes, you can buy it. You can buy it online. You can get a PDF version, and then you've got it. It's fairly dry reading, but it's good to go through, at least in pieces, to look and see what's in it. it contains direction for the assessor. I will say something, it's a little bit sad, but it's the truth. I went in 2005 to West Conshohocken, Philly for a 2-day training on the ASTM standards, and it was fantastic. We actually did a PCA of the office building where we were doing the training. It's fantastic. We looked at a boiler, we took apart an air handler, it was great. I went and did it in 2015 in San Diego, and it changed considerably. It went from being about, here's how you can do a quality PCA, with saying, here's what you shouldn't do. And listen, I know there are things that we shouldn't do, I get it, but as an inspector, all you want to do is the best inspection you can. But it's become a lot more about liability and a bit of a CYA. Again, it's a very good standard, and it makes us all know we're working off the same guidelines and expectations. But, for example, you don't comment on lighting atoms. Now, that makes sense to me, but what that means is, if I'm inspecting a building for you in Brooklyn and it's 11 a.m. and I've never been there before, and I don't intend to come back because the property condition assessment is a 1-day visit, I don't know how your lighting is. I'm not there at night. I'm not measuring foot candles or lumens. I have to go on what I observe and what I review on documents and what is reported by typically the maintenance person. You don't turn equipment on. Now, this might seem like a little bit of a cop-out. Oh, how could you not turn equipment on? Well, there's a few reasons. One is, if you start turning equipment on, where does it end? But even after that, sometimes you don't want to turn equipment on if you don't know how to operate it. You should not turn your boiler on if it's 90 degrees outside. You know, there's things that operating equipment has a place in the world of assessments, but not in the ASTM assessment. One of the things I would say as well is, we're going to talk about an equity assessment in a minute. We don't do destructive testing. You do not make a hole in the wall and say, aha, I knew there was no insulation behind here. Now, I will tell you what we say to our inspectors is, if you've got a unit where, and this happens, it's kind of funny how it happened, the maintenance person will say, you know, I'm going to bring you in apartment 12E. I'm going to warn you, I got the walls open because we're working in there. My reaction is, that's fantastic. I want to see behind the walls. I want to see the construction backup of the bearing walls. I want to see the insulation. I want to see that. So if we get a view of it, great, we love it. But you don't do destructive testing. You're not making holes in walls and ceilings and flooring. You don't remove panels. Now, you can do some cheats with looking at panels and seeing the wiring, but we're not taking apart panels. We're not taking equipment apart. We're not taking controls apart. We're not doing an energy assessment. We do those, we do many of them, but that's not part of the ASTM. It's not a structural analysis, and there's no load analysis done. All right, I just told you a lot of things about what it's not. Now, let's get into, perhaps what it is, but the reason is that these things do have a place outside of or built upon the ASTM. So, for example, if we were to come back and see some real structural concerns in the foundation walls, we're going to recommend and include that a properly trained, certified, and capable structural engineer assess the cracks, maybe do some destructive testing, maybe do some load testing, and determine, here's the issue, and then they would come up with a plan or corrections with designs, recommendations, and costs. So it's not that it's not going to be needed, but it goes above and beyond the liability and the involvement of a property condition assessment. Now, you really can actually break this into two categories. A debt property condition report, pretty straightforward. That's the ASTM guideline. That is done for perhaps a bank, a lending institution, a syndicator, etc. It could be done by a purchaser or someone who is shopping around and wants to know the assessment for the bank. It's usually done by one person, could be several if it's a big building. It's 1 day on site. There's no destructive testing, there's no operation of equipment, etc. That is a debt PCR, and that is the ASTM 2018 standard. On the flip side, you can do an equity PCR. Now, an equity property condition report is quite different. It includes consultants. It could include studies and engineers. You could have 3, 4, 5, 6 people on site. It could be multiple day. If you have multiple people on site, you might have someone there that's an elevator consultant that's testing and checking the elevator only. You could have someone there that's a mechanical engineer. They're testing and checking the mechanical systems, operating, they're doing efficiency tests, etc. You could have a structural engineer. You could have a handicap accessible consultant. So the level that this could build to should fit the project and the detail known. It is considerably more money, it's considerably more time and effort, but it's considerably more detail. And it fits the need of an equity PCR if you have someone that perhaps is investing in this building or buildings and they really want to know, hey, how much are we going to be spending over the next 12 months? This is going to build that scope of work for them. Now, there are other standards that are used. For example, you'll hear us talk a lot about Fannie Mae guidelines. But the Fannie Mae guidelines are quite different than the ASTM guidelines. The ASTM guideline says, here's how you do a property condition report. The Fannie Mae guidelines, for example, one of the things they have is the Estimated Useful Life Table, EUL. They've come up with, back in the early 90s, they came up with 2 groups, family buildings and elderly buildings for apartment buildings. And they said, here's how long stuff should last. Roof, 20 years. If it's something that lasts longer in an elderly building as opposed to a family building, they would note it that way in the Estimated Useful Life Table. A few years ago, they updated those tables. They're all available for free online. You could just Google them. And they did 2 things. Number one, they added a column for students because college students are absolute savages. They're animals. They destroy buildings. It's sad, actually. You'll see buildings that are 1 or 2 years renovated and they just get destroyed by college students. So that's a separate category now. And then the second thing they did is they added a lot more detail. But the Fannie Mae guidelines are the basic industry standard for how long things should last, the estimated useful life. Okay, well, how many units are visited in a PCR? That depends. If you're doing most HUD programs, got to get in 25%. If it's a Fannie Mae property condition report, they have a formula. Freddie Mac is 10% or 5% over 200 units, although you need pre-approval. New York City, the integrated physical needs assessment is 10%. Industry standard is 10%. What does the ASTM standard say? Doesn't say. The ASTM standard does not tell you how many units to get into. So when we bid on an ASTM 2018 property condition report, we assume you want us to go into 10%. Can you ask for 50%? Sure. You can ask for 100%. You can ask for anything you want. As long as we're bidding on the same thing that you would desire, we're in good shape. But by default, industry standard is 10% with vacant and down units counting toward that group. And the difference between a vacant and down, vacant unit's ready to occupy. Down unit is, it needs at least 2 more days of work. You're not ready to occupy, but it is unoccupied with work going on. So what's the process? Obtain the site contact when the agreement is signed. We send a request for information with various pieces of info we're looking for. We set up the inspection. We can send a questionnaire, do an interview, then do the inspection and the report. Now, a questionnaire is required as per the ASTM standards. However, we do not do a pre-sent questionnaire in New York City. We found it backfires. People are very busy, and generally speaking, no one answers it ever. So what we do is we bring it to site. We bring it when we're doing the inspection and cover it when we're doing the inspection. We find we get better info because you're not just typing a couple words, we're actually having a discussion. And then the second thing is we can follow up with questions, whereas if you write an answer, we can't. pre-COVID, one of my favorite things is you might be on these jobs where you meet someone and they're really like hustling, like, all right, let's go, come on, let's start. I don't even ask them a question until we get in the elevator. The moment we're in the elevator, I say, let me go over a few questions with you, because they're captive. I know I got them for a few minutes till we get to the roof. Biggest issues in the field: apartment access, lack of maintenance history, and a property condition report versus a renovation, which I'm going to dive into in a few minutes. But apartment access is a big one. It's a big one. And then aside from the inspection, overall site and building info is included, as well as mold, seismic zone, flood zone, some other information that is a research piece in addition to our observation piece. We also look for problematic materials. This is not an exhaustive list, but this list continues to grow over the years. They're generally industry standard items. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, hold on, I shouldn't comment that. Freddie Mac in particular mentions these things, or a lot of these things, right in their requirements. Some of them are mentioned in the ASTM, some are mentioned in other guidelines. So we try to keep an exhaustive list of these things. And by the way, in our reporting, we have a boilerplate section where we define what these things are and what you do if you have them, just for kind of reference purposes. We send out a request for information, which has several bits of information we're looking for to get familiar with the property. And, we rely on the maintenance and management people. I mean, if you have a maintenance person who's been there 15, 18, 20 years, which happens a lot, they're our best friend that day. Could they lie to us and hide things? Yeah, they could. But all we could do is try to get the best information we can to put our report together. So if we go into that 10% of units, and let's say we went in 10 apartments, because there's 100 total, 10 apartments. And of the 10, 5 of them need new kitchens. And the other 5 kitchens were replaced over the last few years. Unless we have other information to tell us otherwise, we're going to assume that 50% of the kitchens are in need of replacement, because that was the sample that we extrapolate out to the total number. So when we're writing the report, estimated useful life, EUL, dictated by Fannie Mae, we talked about that a little. So for example, roof, 20 years. Now they actually added some details on those things. But estimated useful life, EUL, tells you how long something should last. Okay, that's the first piece of the puzzle. So if you have a water heater and it's 12 years, it should last you 12 years. Now, you might say, well, wait a minute, what if I'm in an area that has very hard water and I don't have a softener? It's probably not going to last 12 years. Well, you might say, well, what if I have an electric water heater and it's not used very much and it's brand new and it's great quality and it's high efficient? Could it last for more than 12? Of course it can. These are just the starting points. Generally speaking, 12 years for a water heater. Effective age, how old is it? And then remaining age is the difference. So if I have something that should last 50 years and it's 40 years old, I'm going to be replacing it in 10 years. Again, this is the starting point. We've got a lot of buildings we do in the 5 boroughs and other mature cities where you've got foundations and structures that are 100 years old. We're not replacing them. They're going to last another 100 years. We're going to do work, we're going to do pointing, and we're going to do work to keep them up. But these are not black and white exact rules. They're a guideline and they're a starting point. So we'll note this. Let's say it's windows. Windows last 30 years. Now again, you might say to me, wait a minute. If you pay for a top of the line, thermal break, fiberglass window that's triple pane, is that going to last 30 years? No, it'll last longer than 30 years. But again, let's just use our numbers that we have by Fannie. So 30 is your window, effective age is 10, remaining is 20. We're going to note the condition, how many, and if we have any recommendations for work or attention. We're going to talk units. Now, everything can be broken down into a unit, or if it cannot, then the unit is, perhaps lump sum or allowance, which I'll get into. So unit would be each, for example, I'm going to replace 53 refrigerators. It would be each 53. Unit could be apartment. I'm going to paint apartments. I have 22 apartments. I'm going to put 22 apartments get painted. So the unit there is apartments. You could have square foot. For example, I'm going to replace sidewalk concrete. I could do that per square foot. So your unit is how are you measuring that item? And then your unit cost is how much per that item. So if I said I'm going to resurface, well, 5 is low for concrete, but let's just say it's right. I'm going to replace something and it's $5 per square foot of concrete. Once I know how much or the unit, I can determine my price. Costs are broken down into 3 groups. Critical, which is life safety. You need to do this within 72 hours and you do not have time to bid. This is big. This is important. This is hazardous. And this is very rare. We don't see this a lot, but it does come up. I did a building not that long ago. It was in New York City, it was in Manhattan, and the electric switchgear was under the sidewalk. It was in the sidewalk vault. It's how they used to build buildings. And there was considerable water coming in from the sidewalk. And what they did was they took a cover of a storage bin and duct taped it on top of the electrical switchgear. That's not going to work. You need better attention to that. Even if you just put up a temporary structure with something to divert the water away, that's not going to work to keep water away because it's just destined to fail. That's a critical. They're fairly rare, but we reserve it to say you got something you got to put attention to immediately. Immediate. Okay, your immediate costs are typically your 12-month cost, your renovation cost. It's broken or it's near broken. It's near the end of its useful life. And then reserves. Usually, it's 15 years, which follows the immediate period. Do you want 20 years? I have 20 years. We've done 30 years. We've done 5 years. It's really up to what your needs are, which typically lines up with the loan. 15-year vehicle, financing vehicle, 15-year reserve. Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, for example, by default, are the loan term plus 2. So we might do 17 years, 15 plus 2. We might do 12 years, 10 plus 2, etc. And all costs are put in current dollars, and then the Excel does the work for us to compute the 3% inflation. So we're asked all the time, how do we come up with the costs? Comparables. Comparables. We have a lot of costs we do, renovations of ongoing projects. We use those costs to see what are people paying for X, Y, or Z. We do not include maintenance costs, not your traditional or typical maintenance costs. Not really the function of a PCR. Some costs are easy, like how much per refrigerator. That's pretty straightforward. Your labor is 0. Your install sophistication is very low. Your time to do it is very quick. You unplug one fridge, you plug the next one in, and you're done. How much you're going to pay for the fridge, that's your cost. Pretty simple. Others are very difficult, like facade restoration. I won't go down a rabbit hole of facade restoration, but you really can't. Anyone who tells you I know exactly what the facade cost is going to be before they start, they're lying to you. Because in New York City or typical mature cities where you have an older building stock, you typically have brick, not always, but typically, you don't know what you're up against until that restoration company starts scraping the grout, the joints, starts knocking on the brick. It might be hollow behind. We got water, the parapet's leaking, the coping's compromised, the bulkhead shot. We don't know until we start really peeling back the building from the restoration company standpoint. Very difficult. What do? We use comps. It's really all we can do until you start peeling the building back. You know, and anyone who's ever done any kind of home project or any kind of project where you remove a wall and you, oh boy, I didn't know I had water back here. That's the surprise that we're worried about. Costs are replaced with like kind at the end of EUL. So I bolded this, not because I'm a crazy person, but this is a very important comment. Costs are replaced with like kind. How are you heating your building? We have a steam boiler. Okay. Let's say we say the steam boiler is going to last another 10 years. We'll put in a new steam boiler in year 11. Pretty simple. Replace with like kind. Now, they might say to us on site, you know, we're thinking about getting rid of the steam boiler and going to wall pack systems with condensers on the roof for heating and cooling. That's terrific. That's a great consideration. Heat pumps, efficient equipment, great idea. That does not belong in a property condition report, because where does it end? They might say, you know, we're thinking about going to solar panels and then doing all electric equipment. Good for you. That doesn't belong to PCR. They might say, you know, we're thinking about taking that community room, gutting it, insulating it, putting an apartment in there, and then the current super's apartment, making that into a retail space. Great. Doesn't belong in a PCR. And the reason is those what we want to do's really could never end. I did a building not that long ago in downtown Manhattan, and it was 6 stories. And as I'm walking through, the contact kept alluding to something. Finally, I said, what are you talking about? He said, oh, we're adding 3 floors. That's what you want the cost for, right? And I'm like, not really. I'll take them, but I'm not putting in adding 3 floors into my report, because add 5 floors, add 10 floors, buy the air rights or development rights from your neighbor. You know, that's a slope that just doesn't end. So the PCR is replaced with like kind. Now, when I say that, we might recommend, hey, you really should do an energy audit here because you've got a lot of very inefficient lighting, and we'd recommend that. Or we might say, you know, they've got a boiler that appears to have asbestos piping, and although we're not doing a phase 1, you're not replacing it with new asbestos piping. So like kind that is currently code compliant is really a better way to look at that. But I think it makes sense when you think about it in terms of, you know, the wish list just could never end. And on a property condition report, it's to preserve the asset. We want to preserve this asset. This is the key. We're not looking at it as a renovation by default. It's to preserve the asset. Someone says, I'm not doing a reno, but I got to keep this thing moving. We're here to help. Here's how that also can show itself as different. If we're looking at preserving an asset, keeping this apartment building going, for example, we want to replace the kitchen cabinet and countertop in 1 unit. Okay, we'll put in 1 kitchen cabinetry, 1 kitchen countertop. Maintenance might do this, but the labor won't be very high. It's 1 unit. We don't need a dumpster. We can break it down and put it out at the curb. That's how we're replacing the kitchen in a PCR by default. I'll get to that in a second. How does that compare with a renovation? Well, in a renovation, you're going to be doing all your kitchens. You got 125 apartments in this building. You're doing 125 kitchens. That's 125 cabinets to come down, 125 countertops to come down. You're going to have dumpsters. You're going to have demo costs. We're going to need a site office. We're going to need some place to store the new cabinets. We're going to need someone to run this thing, which is not for free. So that renovation is going to have different costs included on top of it, like general conditions, like dumpsters, like site office, very real costs, but doesn't belong in a PCR by default. So when we replace with like kind, like the cabinet or the boiler, we don't look at saying, hey, we need to reconfigure this. Some other markups that don't belong in a PCR by default are general conditions, profit or overhead. Now, let me address the by default. We don't by default include those things. We do asset preservation. However, what if someone says, you know, I'd like to do all the kitchens, even though I don't have to? Well, first of all, tenant paid items are not included. So if you have a retail space, you have a Panera, you have a Starbucks, you have a, what did I get from my wife? Sephora, I got a box next to me, I got to bring home. You get a Sephora, you get a store in there. That is on the tenant for their improvements, FF&E, etc. So let's dive into what I mean by how we consider these items. Now, if we're doing an asset preservation and we're replacing one kitchen, it's pretty straightforward. If we're doing a renovation, we're doing a big project and we're replacing all of them, it's going to take into account things that we don't include, general conditions, profit overhead. So we might note that if we know that's going to happen, but it's not included as of right by the PCR. So let's look at another example. We have a leaky roof. Okay. One option is we can rip the roof, replace the decking as needed, new building paper, new shingles, gutters, leaders, and a good warranty. That's expensive. That's very expensive. Now you bought yourself a lot of years of quality, but it's expensive. That's a big project. Okay, same leaking roof. We can rip the roof, replace building paper and shingles. All right, good roof. I like it. Good cost. Not quite as quality as the first one, but a little less money. Okay, what about, this is all for pitched roof, by the way. Just I like to put it in things that people kind of can know what we're talking about. We can do a new roof over existing shingles. So in other words, what we're doing is we're just going over the existing with new. Cheaper, quicker, not quite as good a warranty perhaps, not quite as good an install. We'd really rather go over building paper, but you can do it. Or you can do Flex Seal. You could do that. Cheap, quick. Did you buy yourself 2 decades? I doubt it. And by the way, where you have one leak, you're going to soon have another probably. So the question is, which is right? Well, aside from the fact that everyone loves the Flex Seal guy, and he saw it a boat in half, it really depends on what the standard for that building, for that occupancy, and for that building type is. So if we're looking at something and we say, what would you normally do? They go, well, what we would normally do is rip the roof, new building paper, and roof. That is what we would put in. If we disagree, if we say, you know, you can't just use Flex Seal on this, then we're going to disagree. And we're going to put in the report what a prudent person would do. Because again, what they want to do is the starting point. If we agree with them, is up to us. So they say we're going to put a rubber band on it. We say, nope, that's not enough. We're going to put in a more robust fee. Because if that maintenance person quits tomorrow, a prudent person is going to come in and say, I'm not putting a rubber band on this. This is what I need to take care of properly. And let me get back to the renovation just for a minute, and then we're going to go to finish into the metric. So the one thing I would say with the renovation is anytime we do a property condition report, we inherently have 2 versions that you're buying, that we bid, an initial and a revised. What can happen between those 2 is we get a roofing bid, we get some input from some residents, we get a warranty, whatever it might be. But the question is, are we willing to make a change in our report? And the answer is, of course, if it's reasonable. For example, if I look at a roof and say, you know, you're going to have to replace this roof in about 3 years, and they go, you know what, we're doing the roof on building A and building B and building C, because they're all shot. Building D, maybe we could get a few more years, but you know what, we're just going to replace it now. Early replacement. Do we have an issue with that? No, we love that. That makes a lot of sense. Number one, it's prudent because it's replacing early an item like a roof that's going to cause damage if you take it to exhaustion. Take a light bulb to exhaustion. Don't take a roof to exhaustion. Number two, you're probably going to get a better schedule, warranty, etc. by doing all 4 buildings now. So we want to be part of that conversation, and we're reasonable. If someone says, look, you put that in year 8, we're probably going to do that in year 10. Okay, I don't have a crystal ball. The further out I look at years that I have to forecast, the more uncertain I am. I just don't know. We could have 2 Sandys over the next summers. We could have none over the next 10 years. I have no idea. We had no snow this past winter. This next winter, we can get 100 inches. That will change how our pavement looks next spring. So we just don't know and can only go off our data. The only problem we ever have, if we say you need to do X and someone says no, or we're not going to do that until year 10, that's a problem. You want to do it early, we can get on board with that and we'll note it. You want to punt it until later or not do it and it's critical or it's an important item, we're not going to be revised on that. We're going to stay with our number. So let's bring these costs to a comparable metric, because this is, I think, the most important way we can summarize all of these costs from our standpoint. So for example, I have a hybrid. You have a Suburban. We each fill our gas every month. So therefore we have the same efficiency, right? No, of course not. I get 32 miles to a gallon. You get 8 miles per gallon. That is the metric we need in order to compare them. And I like to use cars whenever I'm explaining PCRs because people can wrap their head around that. So if we both fill up monthly, it's irrelevant. But 32 miles per gallon and 8 miles per gallon now makes them comparable. That's the metric we were looking for. So what we use is reserve costs per apartment per year inflated with inflation. So very simply, it's a long looking number, but really it's how much do I have to put aside for each apartment each year with inflation. So back in the 90s and even early 2000s, Freddie Mac said $250 nationwide per apartment per year inflated. I pushed back on that a lot. And I said, you can't compare a building in the middle of the Bronx to the middle of Kansas. It's just not fair. It's not fair to either one of them. Certainly it's not fair to the Bronx building. They're paying so much more for materials and labor and everything else. So that metric is how we can compare things. But I would absolutely caution against using black and white numbers for a long period of time that are going to ebb and flow. You look at COVID-19. I'm pleasantly surprised from a cost standpoint. We haven't seen spikes yet in materials and work, but that's the kind of thing that's going to impact costs. And, it is. If you're ever going to buy out a big parking lot job, don't do it in the spring. That's when the schools do it. You're going to pay more. Do it in the fall. You want to get your roof done? Same thing. You want to lock in your landscaping contract? Do it in the winter when they're looking to lock in work in the spring. Don't call them when the sun comes out in May. Why is this? Well, costs change. The market changes. Things change. So we really don't want to get locked into those metrics for too long. But you can compare report to report. I can take two quite different reports and projects, but if they're both in the same class, let's say multifamily rental apartment, affordable housing, I know I can compare the two using a metric like 32 miles per gallon and compare building to building. One other thing I'd say to keep in mind with this is these costs do not include critical and 12-month. They just include reserves. So here's how that plays out. You want to spend a lot of money in the 12-month, you get a low reserve. You spend nothing in the 12-month, you're going to have a higher reserve. What about a new building? Low 12-month, low reserve. So obviously how this plays out is a lot of times we'll do a property condition report for a building that is about to be renovated. And the bank will say to us, we want two cost charts, as is and post-renovation. And it's interesting because I tell our inspectors all the time, don't look at the numbers at the end until you get to the end because you don't want them to be biased. But it really lines up very, very well. If I'm looking at a building that needs to be renovated, I'm going to have a big 12-month number and pretty low reserves. If I'm looking at a building that was just renovated, I'm going to have a pretty low 12-month number, but still pretty low reserves. And that's how it foots out. But if I'm looking at a building that doesn't need a renovation and things are different ages and different conditions throughout the building, I'm probably going to have a medium to low 12-month, but a medium reserve because I'm not doing everything now. And I think that inherently makes sense. And how those things compare is obviously critical in how we look at this building or buildings and compare it to others. So that's pretty much in a nutshell how we approach what we're doing for the guideline, ASTM, how the process goes with doing the assessment, the observation, and the reporting, how we look at costs, how we include costs, and kind of at the end of the day, what that metric is and how it's used to compare building A, building B. So I did finish a little early. I'd like to open up. If anyone has any questions or comments, please go ahead and use the chat function there. And that's pretty much it. Obviously, if anyone has any questions or comments after this, you could go to our website, kowbc.com, shoot us an email, give us a call, whether it's about a project, whether it's, hey, something you said didn't make sense, please, by all means, let us know or let me know. We're happy to get back to you with anything we can help with. So it looks like I do have a question. When is it okay to use cost when an owner provides it? Excellent question. It's always a great idea to consider owner costs, but we might make an adjustment. We might even disagree. They may not be telling the truth. They may have another motive in mind, but we always start with their costs as a starting point, typically because it's usually backed up by a bid. So if I say, hey, what do you think it's going to cost to rebuild the parapets on the south and the east walls? They go, we just got a bid from our mason on that. I'll send it over to you. That's delicious to me because it not only has the cost, but it has what they're going to do, how long it's going to take, the materials they're going to use, a warranty. That is gold. Do we just accept it blindly? No. But we'd much rather have something to look at and perhaps agree or disagree than just come up with it ourselves. Someone says, do you use a factor for pricing like RS means for different regions, upstate New York, etc.? I don't want to throw our competitors under the bus, but we have not had great luck with RS means, particularly in and around New York City. A number of years ago, and by the way, what RS means is, for people that aren't familiar, they come up with a national cost. Then you look where your building is, or buildings, and you make an adjustment, and that's how you get your cost. So for example, the last time I checked, Albany was 1.0. 1.0. Albany was the national average of construction and renovation costs. The Bronx is 1.8. So something that costs you $100 in Albany costs you 180 in the Bronx. So that means if I come up with costs using RS means, like let's say they give me the cost per square foot of concrete at $9. Okay, replacement, you got to do demo. Let's say it's $12. $12, okay. And let's say I'm looking at an area that's a 1.5 factor. I'll use $18 per square foot, for example. I found that it does not even close to compare to actual costs from comps. Costs for a renovation project we have in the same town or the same area that has real costs from the mason, the concrete, the roofer, the mechanical, the painter, you name it. That is much, much better. A few years ago, I had one of our property condition inspectors on 3 projects. I said, I want you to take 3 projects, and I signed up for a free trial for RS Means Online. And I don't mean to throw RS Means under the bus at all, but I said, okay, here's what I want you to do. For 3 PCRs, I want you to do your normal thing. Then I want you to put in the data and see what the national average gives you with an adjustment for location. And all 3, I said, how'd it go? And he said, it was a disaster. It just was not at all close. I'll give you another example of why that could be. You could look at Manhattan and it would have one cost, or New York City would actually have one cost. Well, what if that building is in Midtown and just to get a sidewalk shed there is going to be more expensive than if it's in Northern Harlem? Or what if that is in Eastern Queens versus downtown Manhattan, where just to get materials delivered is more of an effort? In other words, it doesn't take into account those nuances which actual costs from a comparable project would. So, okay, to check it perhaps as a reference, but not really the best way to go about it, in my opinion. So Gory, thank you, great question. Why is fire retardant plywood a concern? Okay, so every one of those problematic materials has kind of a cool story, not cool, has kind of an interesting story with it. Every one of them does. Fire retardant treated plywood, here's what happened. Back in the 90s, a lot of homes and buildings that had pitched roofs with wood decking. So this is, we're not talking about your big urban projects, okay. If they use fire retardant treated plywood, that fire retardant treated plywood has a liquid in it, a glue in it to make it fire retardant. What would happen in extreme heat, meaning it's up on the roof, getting baked in the sun, it would prematurely delaminate or peel away, and now you have a roof leak. So that's where that one came from. So every one of those problematic items has a bit of a backstory, and that's what that one is for fire retardant treated plywood. How about this question? I'll ask myself a question. Of those problematic materials, which one is the biggest concern? I'd say probably two. Number one, back in the early 2000s, it was decided as a country that we're going to get rid of R22 refrigerant in mechanical systems. It was we wanted to go to something that was a little more environmentally friendly. Wasn't much of a greenhouse gas. So as of 2015, you couldn't get equipment anymore that had R22. It's now R410A. It's a friendlier, environmentally friendlier refrigerant. As of 2020, they're not going to have any more refrigerant R22 to recharge your systems. They're getting rid of the secondary market. So if I did a building inspection tomorrow and I saw R22 refrigerant, which you still see a lot of, I would not necessarily say replace it today, but I'd say don't really spend a lot of money if something happens with this, just replace it with R410A. Here's the problem. Can I just replace the unit? No. R410A as a refrigerant has a higher pressure rating and usage than R22. Therefore, you'd actually have to replace your suction and your condensate piping, your supply piping. The second one that we see still fairly often is the Federal Pacific stab lock breaker switches. So this is an electrical breaker switch that goes in your apartment, made by Federal Pacific. It sounds like it's a California company, but it's actually from New Jersey. That if you hear the rumors, they cheated on their underwriting tests. But anyway you slice it, they had a problem with this line of breaker switch, whereas it didn't trip at an overload, which is the only thing you need a breaker switch to do, most importantly, is trip if it's overloaded. It was a civil action lawsuit. Federal Pacific lost. There were fires, and it was very tragic, actually. They're now out of business, but you still see them. Anytime we see those breaker switches, which you still see them in the 5 boroughs, you still see them. Maybe a building that was renovated in '95 or something, they put them in, and we want to replace those immediately because they're not going to do the one thing we need more importantly than anything else, and that is for the switch to pop if we've overloaded. So those are probably the two most common we see on that problem child list. All right, well, I think that's about it for this. So I want to thank everyone for attending and watching and contributing. One more week next week, and I think I'm going to have a surprise announcement after this is all done. That'll make next week. But next week, 1 to 2, all about controlled inspections in New York City. And that'll be the last week of the 8-week. Share it with friends. Recommend if they want to watch us on YouTube. And otherwise, thank you for watching. I very much appreciate it. Take care out there. And as always, wash your hands. Thank you.